Hello, my lovely anatomists and physiologists. Michele Glass here, and we're talking about visceral reflexes. Now, reflexes are something we talked about in Anatomy and Physiology Part 1. So we should already know that these are like automatic, quick responses. And we talked about them in Anatomy and Physiology Part 1 as being either cranial or spinal reflexes. And of course, that matters depending on where the processing is happening. Is it in the brainstem or is it in the spinal cord? We talked about your reflexes as either being learned or innate. And because we're looking at visceral reflexes, these are all innate, hardwired, hard programmed. We also talked about reflexes as being either somatic, which is like, again, movement of our body, right? Versus visceral, which is the organ. So obviously we're looking at the visceral reflex here. So this is part of the autonomic nervous system. This is basically that system that's monitoring your heart rate and blood pressure and respiratory rate, and then making adjustments, or monitoring the buildup of pressure in the bladder as urine is stored there, or pressure in the large intestine, and preparation for defecation and all that. That's what we're talking about here with visceral reflexes. And so with any kind of reflex, we have what's described as a reflex arc. And the arc here is going to be slightly different. So we're going to have our sensory neuron, and I'm going to draw the cell body here, and we have maybe our dendrites. So I'm drawing my unipolar neuron where I have my dendrites on one end, and then I have my axon, my dendrites becoming continuous with my axon, and my cell body kind of to the side. And here we're going to make the sort of assumption that that we're going to be inside here, the spinal cord. So I'm just going to kind of draw a big circle and just sort of say, okay, this is our spinal cord. And then what we see happening is that that sensory neuron is going to synapse onto a motor neuron. But this motor neuron here is going to be our preganglionic neuron. And then the preganglionic neuron we know is synapsing at the ganglia, depending on whether we're looking at a sympathetic or parasympathetic response. The preganglionic is going to synapse at the ganglia to the ganglionic. And, the image that I'm drawing here is going to be a little bit more like the sympathetic division, because I have a fairly short preganglionic neuron and then kind of a long ganglionic neuron. And I wanted to do that just so we could kind of add onto our axon those varicosity. So remember, we talked about the varicosity as this kind of enlarged section of the axon that's full of the neurotransmitter, and that's actually, when we say a synapse in the autonomic nervous system, despite the drawings I've given you, it's not the same kind of picture as what we saw when we looked at the neuromuscular junction with the skeletal muscle. Now, here's another sort of interesting thing when we talk about our visceral reflexes. These visceral reflexes, what I've drawn here, would be considered a long reflex, because in this case, it's going to go through the CNS. CNS, of course, central nervous system, is your brain and your spinal cord. And in my drawing here, I labeled this as the spinal cord. If we were looking at, sensation coming from the head and neck area, then it might be going through one of those cranial nerves for the parasympathetic division. And so in that case, then it would not be going through the spinal cord, right? It'd be going through the brainstem. One of the benefits of these long reflexes is that we get like a coordination of the entire organ. So anytime we say long here, we're talking about going through the CNS. So if we can actually define a visceral reflex as being long, then that means we can also call a visceral reflex a short reflex. So I didn't draw that. I didn't draw that because my drawing here, we're going through spinal cord. A short reflex is going to be very localized. It's going to totally bypass the CNS. And so we're doing processing at the ganglion, or ganglia for plural. And this shortcut is possible. So it's kind of like a shortcut, and it's possible because of the ganglionic neuron, because of those ganglia. So what that would be saying, if I drew that picture, I'm going to keep the picture that I currently have, but this time I'm going to have a sensory neuron just coming straight in to my ganglionic neuron. And then you can just totally take care of localized control. We're going to see this really huge when we look at the enteric nervous system. Enteric is, of course, talking about the GI tract. As we talk about these autonomic reflexes or visceral reflexes, another thing to mention here is what's described as referred pain. And referred pain is, probably the classic example that we've heard of before is, you're having a heart attack, and rather than like feeling that your heart is in pain, you're feeling the pain through your left shoulder. And you can see in this diagram that I've posted from your OpenStax textbook that you've got all these color-coded regions of a human figure, and then they're labeled. So here you're seeing that if your heart is in trouble and your heart is hurting, you don't feel it as, oh, my heart hurts. You feel it as my whole left chest, my left shoulder, and my left arm hurt. We see kidney pain spreading throughout the whole lower abdominopelvic region and extending to the inner and outer thighs. And so you're seeing this kind of idea. I think the best way to understand referred pain is we're basically seeing that, or the way I'm understanding it is, we get these sensations being transmitted onto the brain, but it's kind of not our typical pathway. We're not used to feeling what is going on in our heart. We're not used to feeling in a conscious level awareness what's going on in our kidney or what's going on in our small intestine and so forth. And so it's sort of like, I think the brain is to some extent like misinterpreting the information because of the shared pathway, because the signal is coming in and stimulating an area that's typically talking about the left chest and shoulder and arm, even though the pain, there's nothing wrong with the left shoulder, chest, and arm. It's the inside, it's the heart. The brain can't really pick out that nuance, right? And so this is just an interesting bit of information, I think. All right, y'all, stay tuned. We're going to talk just briefly about enteric nervous system. We have a couple other videos just to finish up chapter 15. As always, take care of yourselves and each other.